All right. We are in week 8 of our art appreciation. And so I wanted to go over kind of what's due this week and what we have to look forward to. So this week we are looking more at to-do art. And this time we are focusing on painting. So you are going to read the section content, and then we are going to have a discussion assignment about great master works, and then you will complete a quiz. So I've got to start a few examples, a PowerPoint that talks about some different painting styles. So I'd like to play my slides for you. The first slide we have here talks about painting and how paint is composed of 3 materials: a pigment, a binder, and a solvent. And as we go through, we will talk about more of those individually. So a pigment is a natural or synthetic colored material that is finely ground into powder. It could be from clay, gemstones, minerals, paints, or insects. And you'll notice that in many of the pigments that were used many years ago, they only had those types of materials offered to them at that time. They couldn't go to a store and just buy a tube of paint like we can today. So they would create their own. So then the binder, and that is what holds the pigment together. It also adheres the paint to a paint surface. So some different binders might be egg yolk, linseed oil, which is here, or wax. A solvent is added to thin or thicken your paint. It also helps slow or speed up the drying time. And some different solvents might be water or oil. And as we go through, you'll learn that different types of paint also have different drying times. So paint can be applied to a canvas, or I guess depending on your material or your surface you're working with. It might not always be your traditional canvas. It could be wood, metal, the walls, different things like that. But many of the different tools that paint is applied with are brushes, fingers, painting knives, and sticks. You'll notice we can take a look at an artist named Jackson Pollock, and he created these large master pieces of work that were created with sticks. He would splash the paint on the canvas. And I will show you kind of a few videos of him as well. So to our left, we've got different types of paint brushes. And then to our right, these are different types of paint knives. Then we go to different types of paint. Most of you have probably worked with tempera, watercolor, or acrylic. But you might also see oil paint. That is another type of paint used. And that is a more slow dry paint, which is much thicker. Your tempera paint is going to be very thin. It's a paint that's used a lot of times with younger students. And it dries very fast. And it comes out of a lot of different clothing and different things like that. Where oil paint is a very thick paint, a lot of times you will use a paint thinner or different materials to thin out the paint while you're painting. This oil paint here takes a long time to dry. Sometimes it can take up to a month to dry. Watercolor is, and oil paint too, is also very difficult to control. It's hard, but it mixes really well. You can create a lot of different colors with oil paint. Watercolor paints are just that. You take your paint and you mix it with water. Watercolors are very difficult to control, obviously, because water is a very fluid liquid. that has a tendency to move. And there are different watercolor techniques so that we can also take a look at. Gouache is another type of paint. That's again another thicker type of paint. A lot of times you'll see like Jacob Lawrence created paintings out of gouache. Acrylic, that is a fast drying paint. It mixes well on the palette. You don't necessarily need anything to thin it out, but a lot of times if you are going to make it thinner, you would add water to it. And it is a very fast drying paint. You could paint a picture with acrylic paint and it would dry within 1 day. Encaustic is another type, and then Cason, which those two I'm not very familiar with, so I would definitely have to take a look at those. So tempera here is a water-based paint. It is an egg binder. It was used mainly in the 1400s. Colors cannot be mixed. It has a narrow range and a fast drying time. Excuse me. Then we've got oil. Oil is easily mixed. It has a lot more pigment. It was used after the 1400s and it is slow drying. It can be used in thin layers called glazes or thick lumps to make an impasto surface. And so you can see the two examples here. The one on the right side is a snapshot of a Van Gogh piece, which is very thick. You can see all of the different brush strokes or even paint knife strokes. And the one on the right or left, is a very thin example of glazing. Watercolor is the most common water-based paint. It's transparent. White paint is seldomly used to lighten paint. Normally you would use water if you're going to create a lighter shade of a color. Where light colors are applied first, then dark, working from the background to the foreground. So that would be your watercolor paint. Gouache is a water-based opaque paint, which means it's not transparent. You can't see through it. It has more body and dries more slowly than watercolor, and it is very similar to tempera paint. Acrylic is a synthetic paint with a plaster binder. It was recently made and used in the 20th century. It's versatile and it's similar to oil, but it dries fast and it is not as shiny. Then we have encaustic, which is ancient process of mixing pigment with wax and then ironing the mixture to the surface. And then our last one uses milk protein as a binder, and it's a glue-like consistency. This is also a little brittle to use on canvas. So a fresco, that's a type of painting. It's created on walls, or it's more like a mural. And it's when you mix pigments with plaster on walls or ceilings. And a true fresco is when you paint, the paint is bonded with the wet plaster. And those tend to hold up a lot better because the paint dries within the plaster versus a fresco secco, which the paint is applied to a dry plaster. So a lot of times that paint will end up chipping off. So then we've got paint tubes. They were invented in the late 19th century. It had a tremendous impact on the style and subject matter of Impressionism, and it allowed artists to move out of the studio. So when you talk about Impressionist painters, a lot of times a term that connects to that is called en plein air, which means that they would paint in the open air. They would go out with their canvas, their tools, their paint tubes, and they would create paintings of landscapes out in the wilderness because they had the means of a paint tube. So they had ways to transport their materials. So that's just basic preview of some different types of paint that is used. And I think I will pause this section. I'm going to, the next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about painting styles and techniques. And then I'm also going to show you send some video links of different painters as well. So stay tuned.